Most people think you need expensive brands to get clean coffee, but that's not really true. Kirkland Organic Sumatra is one of those coffees most people overlook because it's a store brand. But when you actually look closer, it's USDA organic. It comes from a region known for more stable beans, and it delivers a level of consistency most people don't expect from something sitting on a Costco shelf. And what makes it even more interesting is that it manages to do that while staying accessible, which is exactly what most people are actually looking for without realizing it. And what makes this even more relevant is that this isn't about the brand trying to position itself as something premium. It's about the product quietly doing what it's supposed to do. Because when the sourcing is controlled and the process is stable, you don't need complexity to carry the experience. And that's exactly why this ends up being one of the most practical options for daily use. And before moving to the next one, it's important to keep this simple, because clean coffee gets overcomplicated very quickly. And for this list, it comes down to three things: organic sourcing to reduce pesticide exposure, lower risk of mold and mycotoxins through better handling, and a roasting process that stays controlled instead of pushing into that overburned profile that hides inconsistency instead of fixing it. And once you focus on those three, the entire decision becomes much clearer. Organics is another one that people tend to ignore at first, mostly because it looks like just another supermarket label, something that doesn't stand out or feel different. But the consistency here is what makes the difference. It follows organic standards. It avoids that overly harsh profile you get from poorly controlled roasting, and it stays accessible, which is a bigger factor than most people realize. Because a clean option only works if you can actually keep buying it without turning it into a complicated process. And that's where most people get stuck. They look for something that sounds better instead of something that actually works. And in this case, what works is something that you can find that performs consistently and that doesn't fluctuate every time you buy it. Because that's what turns a product into a reliable part of your routine. Pete's Organic sits in a slightly different position because it already carries a stronger reputation. And for a lot of people that creates the expectation of something more refined. And in this case, it actually holds up, because you're getting organic certification, a more controlled roasting profile, and a flavor that feels structured without becoming aggressive. And that balance is what makes it a strong option for people who want something a bit more polished, without stepping into expensive or hard-to-find territory. And what makes this one work is not just the name. It's the way it maintains that balance without drifting too far in either direction. Because once a coffee becomes too dark or too inconsistent, it starts losing that sense of control. And that's exactly what this avoids. Asterisk, and the next one is where things start to get even more interesting. Trader Joe's organic coffees are always interesting, because they sit right in the middle between accessibility and perception. Some people assume they are just basic. Others treat them like hidden gems. And the reality is somewhere in between. Because the organic sourcing is there, the pricing is controlled, and the overall consistency is strong enough to make it a dependable daily option without forcing you to think too much about it. And that balance is exactly what makes it work, because when something is easy to find, reasonably priced, and consistent enough to deliver the same experience every time, it becomes part of your routine without friction. And that's where most clean options fail. Not in quality, but in accessibility, because they turn into something you have to chase instead of something you can rely on. If you've ever noticed how some simple options end up working better than expected, that's not random, and it's exactly the kind of thing most people overlook when they focus too much on branding instead of what actually holds up over time. And that's usually where the real difference is. Kicking Horse Coffee is one of those brands that used to feel more niche. Something you would only find in specialty stores. But over time it started showing up in bigger retail chains. And what makes it stand out is that it's certified organic. It focuses on higher quality sourcing, and it keeps a roasting profile that avoids going too far into that over-roasted territory. And because of that, it ends up feeling more balanced than most supermarket options. And this is where things start to separate a little more. Because while most brands either go to basic or too aggressive, this one stays in a controlled, middle ground, which is exactly what allows it to deliver a more stable experience without becoming complicated. And that's what makes it one of the more interesting options on this list. And when you look at both of these together, a pattern starts to appear. The coffees that work best are not the ones trying to stand out the most. They are the ones that stay controlled, consistent, and easy to integrate into your routine, because that's what actually matters when you're making the same decision every day. And this is where most people get it wrong, because they assume clean coffee has to come from expensive or hard-to-find brands, when in reality, it's much more about a few key factors that determine whether something holds up over time or not. And once you understand that, the entire way you approach coffee starts to shift in a much more practical direction. The coffees on this list are not perfect, but they follow a pattern. They prioritize better sourcing. They reduce unnecessary exposure to pesticides. And they avoid relying on aggressive roasting to hide inconsistency. And that combination is what makes them more reliable in everyday use without forcing you to overthink the decision every time. And once you start looking at coffee this way, the decision becomes much simpler. Because instead of chasing something that sounds better or looks more premium, you start focusing on what actually performs consistently without requiring extra effort. And that shift alone removes a lot of the confusion people usually have when trying to choose a better option. Because, in the end, most people are not looking for the most complex or the most refined coffee possible. They are looking for something they can trust every day, something that doesn't fluctuate, something that doesn't surprise them in a negative way, and something that fits into their routine without turning into a constant decision. And that's exactly why this approach works, because it removes friction, simplifies the process, and gives you something that performs the same way over and over again, which is what actually matters when you're making the same choice every single day. And this is where the biggest shift happens, because once you understand that consistency matters more than complexity in this context, you stop overvaluing things that sound better and start paying attention to things that actually hold up over time. And that changes the way you evaluate, not just coffee, but any product that becomes part of your daily routine. So instead of assuming that everything on a supermarket shelf is low quality, it makes more sense to start paying attention to what actually holds up. Because once you recognize that pattern, the entire process becomes simpler, faster, and much more predictable. And you no longer feel like you need to search endlessly for something better when what you need is already available. And if there's a coffee brand in your area that you keep seeing but you not sure if it actually meets that standard, leave it in the comments, because that's exactly how I decide what to break down next.